we've got another episode for you this week. Please like, share, subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and I hope that you enjoy this week's conversation. This episode will consist of topics around domestic abuse, domestic violence and sexual violence. If you require any support or help, please get in contact with your local domestic abuse, sexual violence organisation. In the UK, you can call the National Domestic Helpline on 0808 2000 247. And if you are listening overseas, please contact your national helpline where support, advice and guidance will be available for you. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of A Conversation With. This week we're gonna I've got a really exciting guest with me this week, and we are gonna talk all things economic. What does that actually mean? So just to set the context of where we're going before I introduce our guest, 1 in 6 UK women will experience some form of economic abuse. In my own practice, like working with survivors, it exists in around about 95% of those domestic abuse cases that come my way. So what does that actually mean? And since the pandemic happened all those years ago, it feels like we're still living in it, but all those years ago, it's actually become worse for those victims since the pandemic and since the cost of living crisis that is kind of hitting not just the UK, but globally as well. So for all of you listeners that are listening overseas, welcome. It's good to have you here again. But, you know, globally, we know that there is a cost of living crisis hitting us, and that can affect people who are experiencing domestic abuse. It will affect their decision-making process about whether they want to stay in this relationship or if they want to leave, and how they're going to leave if they don't have the economic resources to do so. So today's episode, I'm going to speak to, and I'm going to say this wrong, I know it, and I just done a, how do I say your name before? So I apologise, please do correct me, but today we're going to speak to Eleni, who is an economic abuse specialist from Surviving Economic Abuse, and we're just going to talk about economic abuse. What does it mean? Practically, what does that look like? Kind of probably define, I don't know what your thoughts are, but define the difference or the similarities between economic abuse and financial abuse, because I think that they can be quite entwined and sometimes can be quite hard to separate. So I'm going to say hello, welcome.
Hello, thanks very much for having me on today's episode on the podcast.
It's good to have you. Thank you for joining us. So yeah, let's start with that. Like, you know, tell us a little bit about you, about your background and kind of what you do.
Yes, so my name is Eleni and I'm the economic abuse specialist over at Surviving Economic Abuse, or C as we refer to ourselves. And we are a UK charity, and we're the only UK charity dedicated to raising awareness of economic abuse and therefore transforming responses to it. And here at the charity, what we like to do is raise awareness of what is economic abuse and influence changes to like professional practice, systems, policy and legislation. So they are able to recognise economic abuse and have better support and outcomes for victim survivors. We also do a lot of training. We're a research and education organisation, so we're not frontline, but we do a lot of training of thousands of professionals in different sectors, and bringing in sectors around the non-traditional, such as banking, money advice, so that we can all have a holistic response to economic abuse. And of course, yes, so...
No, it's great. It's really good. It's really good to kind of lay the foundations of who you are and what you are, because I think it's such a big area that I think even if I'm being honest, I don't know what your thoughts are, is that we're still getting to grips with, and I still think that there is a lot of professionals that actually still struggle. And then, like, I don't know, kind of again what your thoughts are, but especially
Yeah.
if there is a crime. So, for example, domestic abuse is a crime. So you've got coercive
Mm.
control, you've got the other crimes that are associated with that. But actually, economically, if somebody is being economically or financially abused, kind of what does that mean, and where can I go with that? And if I was a police officer, what crime would I charge somebody with? Because obviously you've got the big ones such as fraud, for example. But so it's really good to kind of go, actually, let's lay this down. So
Yes.
let's lay it down and let's
Let's
start.
lay it down. Yes,
let's
absolutely. But
let's
you're
what does it
absolutely
mean? What does economic abuse mean?
well, do you know, I always like to give the metaphor of the work bag. So thinking about your bag that you need for work, and let's just run through mine. It would definitely have it would have my lunch in it. It would have my house keys. It would have my car keys. It might have my access pass to get into work. It would also have my glasses because I need glasses or contacts to see. It would also have my wallet, my purse, my things, physical money, change, my cards. It also, as an Australian citizen, would have my, like, metaphorically, I would need my right to work, my immigration documents to show that I had a right to work in the UK. So that would kind of be in my bag. Now, when we talk about the term like financial abuse, if I mention financially, you probably start thinking about that purse I have in my bag. You probably start thinking about the money, the change, my credit cards, my debit cards. But when we start talking about economic abuse, it's a more of a broader term, and financial abuse is part of economic abuse. But economic abuse speaks about all those other things that I mentioned, things from basic necessities down to someone's lunch, water, utilities, thinking about things that you would need that has economic worth and is linked to economic safety. So all those things, if those things in my bag were either restricted from me, I had to ask permission to use them, that they would impact on my economic safety, how I went about the world, my professional life. Could I get to work if I didn't have these things, or these things were hidden from me, or I had to ask permission? Also my personal life as well, how that would affect. So that's why we use the term economic abuse, because it broadens it out. Because it's more than just money. It can be survivors' career, children, the lifestyle, basics necessities, immigration documents as well, and they all create instability and that dependence on an abuser. So that's what we mean by economic abuse. But you're right, this kind of term has been growing more traction over the last kind of 15 years. There's more research into it, and lay it down in the legislation speak is that actually economic abuse as a known type of domestic abuse entered the Domestic Abuse Act, England and Wales 2021. So it's now part of our statutory definition. And of course, that links into the Serious Crime Act. Also, post-separation entered at the same time in England and Wales. So these are now considered types of economic abuse, and say police protection services can use the Serious Crime Act to look at these as a crime. So
Which
economic
it's a
abuse
little bit like, like talking just from my own kind of opinions and not based on anybody else's. So my views are my views.
yeah.
But like, I do think that it's like domestic abuse, like, has always been around. It's always been,
Mm.
like, unfortunately, a sad part of a small pocket of our society where survivors have been impacted by abuse. And I know that over the years, more training has been given around domestic abuse, and then particularly, towards the middle of the 2000s, we started learning about terminology around coercive control. But from a
Mm.
domestic abuse perspective, like, when I'm dealing with survivors, those tactics have always been there. So why has it taken so long to have this generalized kind of actually recognize that all of these things of a crime, like, you know, because it
Yes.
hasn't changed in 20, 30, 40 years. All those elements have been there. There's always been economic abuse. There's always been coercive control. But
Yes, absolutely.
but now we're starting to kind of nail that down, which is good. It's a good thing and it's progress. But I think that with all of these things, wherever there is, wherever activists are trying to raise the flag for survivors and kind of get it on the agenda, it's always a slow progress. So the fact that we are talking about economic abuse in this conversation, and more so in organizations being set up and kind of delivering that training, the better it is, because you're right, you know, it is a form of domestic abuse, and if you are experiencing any form of physical or sexual violence or coercive control, you're more than likely going to experience some form of economic abuse. So that could be, and I've seen it, or I see it every day, where somebody is making deliberate attempts of sabotaging education or work. You know, I've had members of staff even, you know, like tell me that their husbands or partners have hidden their keys deliberately to stop them going into work. And then that has a knock-on effect, because if you're late or you're having sickness, then at some point you're going to be pulled up by your manager. There may be some disciplinary actions. And then if then you're being let go, if you're on a temp contract or a 0-hour contract, that then has an economic resource, like an effect, doesn't it? And like the ability to have food, for example. I remember, and I say this story, and I don't know what your personal stories are, but I remember when I first started working in domestic abuse, and I started my career, if you like, and I was supporting a person, you know, an individual, and at the time we were allowed to do house visits before, you know, we took our safety seriously. But I remember doing a house visit, and I done a house visit. It was a joint visit, and what struck me, and I didn't really know anything about economic abuse per se, like, you know, but I walked into this house and I needed to use the bathroom, and I went into the bathroom, and what struck me immediately was that on the right side of the bathroom was all of this value stuff. Like, I don't know if you remember, I don't know how long you've been in the UK, but the old Tesco value logo. Yeah. So on the right side of me was all this Tesco value. There are other brands, but for this, but it was Tesco. But it was like shampoo, conditioner, soap, and toothpaste. And then to the left of me was all this really expensive grooming products that would be for a male. And even though I was still very early in my career, I understood immediately there was a power dynamic within that family. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, of course, that inequality between the two. And I know when you've on previous episodes, when we talked about the Duluth Power and Control wheel, even back in the 80s, we had that segment, didn't we, about economic abuse. So it's not new in the sense of actually back when we were forming our ideas and our foundations about understanding power and control, we knew it back then. We were registering back then. But I think somewhere along the way, the focus has not been on economic abuse, and maybe the research hasn't kind of that we have now, which shows that kind of evidence base that it is intertwined with other forms of abuse. It is connected to safety, and so it's beginning to have its more of a spotlight shined on it. And also the post-separation as well, because after a victim survivor is able to leave an abuser, economic abuse can be the only type of abuse left to you know, be coercive and controlling post-separation. So we see an escalation or an uptake of economic abuse post-separation, because it doesn't need that physical proximity. But I have heard victim survivor stories very similar, their lived experience about having to purchase or even make homemade dinner and bread for the perpetrator, for the abuser, where her and the children are having jacket potatoes and beans, and it's all, you know, it's all kind of non-branded bits, because all that economic resource is focused on meeting the needs of the perpetrator and the entitlement of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
So I absolutely, you were picking up on that power imbalance, that inequality there, that someone is worth less than someone else. Someone deserves more economic resource than the other person. That's very much a tactic of abusers.
And because I did mention it in the intro, and I think it is quite relevant, like to the conversation that we're having, just on a broader scale of what this looks like. You know, in your kind of professional capacity, you know, are you is the cost of living having an effect on those survivors? So, you know, so when they're reaching out, or when you're doing training, for example, is that an
Yes.
element of worry, concern, keeping them in relationships they don't want to be in?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we've produced a report for professionals around the cost of living crisis and that intersection of the cost of living crisis with economic abuse. And we do also have a resource for survivors talking about and framing economic abuse within our cost of living crisis, because it is, you know, abusers are kind of, what we're seeing, might use the crisis as like justification to either begin or ramp up and increase abusive measures. And also that we're seeing that abusers might take advantage of the crisis by introducing new demands or coercions linked to it. So it might be like, oh, you can't have your phone contract, or you can't have the car anymore. We need to, you know, save money. It's a cost of living crisis. You can't put the heating on until I get home. We need to save money. We should move in together. And then when they do that, they don't contribute to the household. So these are all types of ways that the cost of living crisis could be used as justification, or as a platform to create new demands or increase demands, which again, what we're talking about with economic abuse is diminishing someone's independence and putting that dependency on the abuser, which then creates those barriers to leaving. So yeah, creating that dependency on the abuser because you're economically have economic instability, and you become that, yeah, dependent on the abuser, which makes it so much harder to leave. And then of course the cost of living, and thinking about the cost of leaving, actually surviving for a woman with her family as well, thinking about the cost of leaving in amongst the crisis, that again compounds that barrier to leaving, because it's like, well, actually, how do I leave when my economic resources, I don't have access to it, they've been damaged, and now we've got the cost of living, which is, you know, just to put on the heating is more expensive than it was 2 years ago. So how do I do all these things and keep my family running? And so yeah, it creates another layer, another challenge of leaving the abuser. So yeah,
And
we are seeing things.
sorry, and I think it's really important that those that, you know, that whoever is listening, you know, and that you are experiencing some form of financial economic abuse, you don't have access to bank cards, somebody is racking up debts in your name, you know, amongst this cost of living crisis, that you are concerned about leaving or whatever it is. There are a lot of organizations out there that will be able to support you with those steps moving forward. So if anything is stirring you or triggering you, or going, oh, they've said something and that actually that relates to me, then please do reach out to your local domestic abuse organisation, where they'll be able to advise and kind of give you support and moving forward as well, around those next steps. You know, we don't, you know, both of us, we do not want people to be in these dangerous, abusive relationships because of, you know, so reach out and get some support, because there is support out there. There's a lot of organizations, there's lots of grants that are available if
Yes.
you're eligible for those, that will enable you to be out of that situation. And there's a number of organizations that will support you financially, looking at your budgeting, looking at your budget plan and all of that. So it can seem really embarrassing and really scary, but honestly, you know, the support's out there. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Oh yes, absolutely. Exactly what you just said, in the sense that, you know, if this resonates with any of the listeners, please know that you are not alone and you will be believed. And as Shireen said, the domestic abuse frontline services in your local area, if you're experiencing economic abuse, there is, well, research says there's a likelihood that you're experiencing other forms of abuse because it is interwoven with other forms of abuse. But these services are for you. It is in our legislation. It is a crime. So don't feel like, oh, well, actually, I'm experiencing this, but I'm not experiencing, say, physical abuse or sexual violence, that these services are not for you. And there is a lot of other services that you might not kind of think of that are now positioning themselves to help victim survivors. One of the ones I wanted to mention is our partnership with Money Advice Plus, which is a money and debt advice service, and it's bringing together the specialism of economic abuse experience and money debt advice experience, and they've got a helpline. You can find that information on our website, survivingeconomicabuse.
And I will put all of those links and all of that in the chat descriptions for you, so you've got those available if you want to go and check those out at the end of the podcast. I guess that, you know, I don't know how brief we can do it in the few minutes that we've got left, but, you know, so what are some of those signs of economic abuse? And I know that we've given some examples, you know, within that, but, you know, are there particular signs that somebody should be looking out for, or
well, yeah, I mean, some of our recent research that we did around cost of living is that 67% of victim survivors are already in a negative budget or have less than £100 surplus at the end of the month. So that's something to look out for, people who don't have that surplus or are in a negative budget. And victim survivors currently are left with an average amount of debt of around £20,000, which is around 6 times more than we saw in 2020. So you can just see the impact of the pandemic and then the cost of living. So large amounts of debt as well. We do frame the tactics of abusers under categories such as restrict, exploit, and sabotage. Right. So if you are seeing in your patients, in your clients, in the people that you're supporting, a restriction of economic resources, a sabotage of economic resources, and exploitation of economic resources, they are the kind of overhead signs. But on our website, we do have an economic power and control wheel. It's based on the Duluth model, endorsed by Duluth. So check that out. That kind of covers a lot of tactics of abusers that you might see that speaks to economic abuse. And there is a post-separation power and control, economic power and control wheel.
And some of your resources, I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of those resources that you have on your website, they're translated in different languages for those that don't. Yeah.
Yes, we have 4 different languages of like what is economic abuse or understanding economic abuse. We have a resource in 4 different languages. We also have a 4-minute media video, an animation, which talks about what is economic abuse, and that is has 8 different languages in subtitles. So if you do have patients or clients who that is more accessible to them, then and around languages, then we do have those things. We also, something we launched recently, and we haven't really spoken about quickly, is banks. The work that banks are doing and financial services are becoming more clued into how they can support survivors. So we have a How Banks Can Help video as well on our website, and banks are doing some amazing work to think about, just thinking about Lloyds TSB. They've got a domestic and financial abuse team now. Lloyds does. TSB have also launched an emergency fund for survivors to help flee domestic abuse. So there's a lot of changes happening in the financial services. So do speak to your banks if any of this is resonating with you, to think about your economic safety and how they can help you find better economic safety in amongst being a victim survivor of these types of abuse.
And lastly, I guess I just want to again reiterate something I've said earlier, but actually, you know, one of the reasons why people don't disclose about abuse, and it's a thread that's throughout all of the episodes of the podcast, is shame and embarrassment. That's what keeps people in this state of non-disclosure or staying in relationships because they're embarrassed or they feel guilty or they've got a lot of shame with it. And when you then add in the mix of debt or money or lack of money or lack of economic resources, or you can't afford just basic sanitary products, for example, or it can cause discomfort for people, and you've got nothing to be ashamed about. Nobody is going to think any less of you if you reach out. There are organizations that will support you with that. And so, like, you know, I want to encourage you that you're not going to be met with any ridicule or anything if you have found, or you find yourself in a situation where you do not have resources, or you don't have food, or you don't have or you're in this huge amount of debt and you're spiraling, you don't know how to get out of it. You know, you've got nothing to be ashamed of. Please do reach out. I'm going to put the Surviving Economic Abuse links all over this. So you've got those. You've got, like, you know, Citizens Advice. There's other organisations that are available as well. So we'll put the links to those. But please, you know, you are not alone. You know, you will be believed, and there is support and help for you. Thank you so much for joining me this week. It's been great, and I know we could speak for hours. I get the sense that we could talk quite a lot together. I think it would be dangerous going out. Just one thing, I just wanted, like, you know, when you were talking about your handbag, I was sat there going, "Oh my God, you don't want to be looking in mine. I've got pieces of Lego. I've probably got outdated food somewhere." But thank you so much for joining me.
No problem. Thanks very much for inviting us.
It's been amazing, and it's been amazing to shine a light on such a sensitive subject, and it's really encouraging to know that there are organizations like you out there training people like me that aren't necessarily as comfortable going, well, what does this look like, or what does this mean? So, you know, thank you for the great work that you and your team are doing, and all of the amazing reports and everything that then feeds into legislation and policy in the UK. It's amazing. So thank you so much.
Right back at you, Shireen. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You have just listened to the episode on economic abuse. For further information and for some resources that are freely available for both professionals and survivors, please do go to Surviving Economic Abuse's website, which can be found at www.survivingeconomicabuse.org. The link is also in the episode description, where there's also some other links that will take you to some organisations that will be able to support you if you find yourself in financial difficulty as a result of economic abuse. You're not alone. Don't be ashamed. There is support freely available for you.